Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first digital ethnography session of this term with Dr. Andrew Schrock, Cyd Harrell, and Alex Blandford discussing how ethnographic theory and ethnographic practice are incorporated into civic technology projects in the US. A little housekeeping. We are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request that the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. You can pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time, and these will be answered at the end of the talk, and please keep questions as concise as possible. The questions are visible to all attendees, and we will endeavour to follow up on any unanswered queries. Questions can also be upvoted and commented upon. Please allow me to introduce Andrew, Cyd, Alex, and the OxDEG team.
Hi, I'm David Zeitlin, and I am happy to welcome you all to this term's digital ethnography group. This is the first session, and we've got quite a wide range of different presentations through the term. What I wanted to flag, though, is the session in 6 weeks' time, the final session of the term, which is going to be a method surgery. So please, if you have any dilemmas of digital methods that you would appreciate any feedback on, please consider submitting your dilemma to the surgery. What we would want is you to talk for perhaps 5 minutes, 10 absolute maximum, and then the members of the conveners group and the other participants can comment and give you what we hope is useful feedback and suggestions of how to do the particular project that you have in mind. This will be the third one of these that we've done, and we get a really interestingly wide range of problems. Okay, so turning from the program in general to today, I'm very happy to introduce Alex Blandford, who's going to run the session and introduce the other speakers. I should say he is my own research student, and he is a, what do we say, a poacher turned gamekeeper, a participant ethnographer, because he has a long history of involvement in civic tech, working for government, working for NGOs, and most particularly, as far as we're concerned, working for Democracy Club. So over to you, Alex, and I look forward to a really interesting session.
Thank you, David. Yes, a poacher turned consistent poacher, as gamekeeping's bill paying potential is rather low. I'm really excited about today's talk because this is a topic very close to my heart and very close to my research question. We're going to have an exploration of civic technology, largely in the American context today. Civic technology is a really slippery term. In the UK, it often excludes the space of government, whereas for a lot of sort of structural reasons, I think in the US it tends to include it as a sort of a continuum stretching from volunteer through NGO through to work in government, which I think is an interesting comparison and maybe something we'll get into through the course of this. And certainly it's one of the questions in my mind about how you construct all of this. I think the fascinating point about the space of civic technology with ethnography is that it is often a space of micropolitics. Like, ethnography offers quite a radical political project within government, and when applied to kind of the action of the state, and that's something that I'm hoping that we get some time to dig into. And I think it's one of the reasons that this is a really kind of relevant space, aside from the OII's commitment to critique of government alongside critique of internet. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Firstly, Cyd Harrell. I'm going to go for blurbs from the front of books as introductions because I feel like it's the most, it's canon. You know, I'm not going to start inventing for other people. So Cyd is a UX researcher and product manager who got hooked on Civic Technologies at early 2010 hackathons. When Facebook bought her employer in 2012, she chose to invest her career in public service technology work. Cyd has helped US city council, county, federal, and state agencies unlock the power of technology to serve constituents. She's worked independently with the Center for Civic Design, Code for America, and 18F. Over the years, Cyd has been a mentor and leader to many people in the field and is proud to have served as the first Chief of Staff of 18F. And welcome, Cyd. I'll clap in silence.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you. And joining us as well is Dr. Andrew Schrock. And to go to that, there we go. And it's an introduction from front of the website, so I did not have time to run downstairs and get the copy of the book. So Dr. Andrew Schrock is a seasoned author, founder of Alloy. Is it Alloy? I've never been quite sure how to put it.
Yeah, it's French for the English word, Old French.
Oh, that makes...
Because I wanted to be fancy.
I see. Alloy Research and Consulting and author of the book Civic Tech. You see how I found people involved in this field is if they've named their book Civic Tech, it's really easy to find speakers, right? For 15 years, Andrew has helped organizations more ethically and effectively design and use emerging communication technologies for education and civic engagement. So welcome both of our other panelists. And Cyd, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, so I'll just say good morning and thank you. It's morning in California, so thank you so much for having us. As a design researcher, of course, it's a field derived from ethnography. I always feel a little bit shy coming to an actual academic forum, whether my practice is rigorous enough. And yet I have done research in a wide variety of spaces, including American courts, county governments, and city governments, and spent time with both federal technologists and federal career civic servants. And you see how we end up with a whole lot of categories and things to talk about and how civic technology is structured. I think Alex is right in saying that we have a whole spectrum from volunteers who meet in their city hall once a week and assist with problems to people who decide to do terms of service in the federal or state government. I'm curious what Andrew will say about that, but what I have seen over the last 15 years or so is a municipal movement and a sort of focused around the ethic of volunteerism and a federal movement focused around the ethic of service with a capital S, converging slowly to the state and county level where a lot of services are actually delivered and administered. And maybe that's a good start for me.
Okay.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so good morning. Yes, it's still rather early in California. So if I pause, it may not be the video caching, it may be my brain caching. So this is really exciting, and I'm happy to kind of come back to Oxford virtually. I was part of OII Summer Doctoral Program 2013, and I still keep up with all of those folks. That's where I met quite a number of people who would become good friends. Just a little bit more about me to sort of understand who I am and sort of the questions I'm interested in. I graduated with a PhD in communication in 2015 from USC Annenberg. I did a postdoc for about 2 years looking at data scientists in what's known as cyber infrastructure. But really kind of the through line, you know, in my own personal research and the book that I'm now wrapping up is really about organizing around technology design in the public sector. And I really started to use ethnography, I don't know, maybe around 2014, 2015, really to understand the organizational context that this work was occurring in. And so a lot of, you know, those ideas were sort of, you know, or a lot of that methodology kind of brought forward, you know, ideas that now are infused in my writing and in my work. And it really was incredibly helpful to me. Yeah, Civic Tech is sort of like an idea. Clearly, like I have a couple stakes in the ground, and you know, this perpetual debate has been going on for a while. But it means different things in different contexts. I like Alex's, you know, thinking about it, you know, as an invitation to think about, you know, the space of micropolitics. I think it's also, you know, an opportunity to think about how civic tech as kind of an idea is sort of patterned internationally. And so, you know, clearly to me, it doesn't mean the same thing in the UK as it does in the US or in other countries, other continents. So, you know, I still think it has something of a Western, you know, valence to it, but not universally, of course, and we can dispute that. So, yeah, so I'm looking forward to the discussion, both sort of about methods and then about the idea of civic tech and how to unpack and understand that in our current political moment.
Thank you. I think the first question I'd like to maybe ask is something about the word service, because I think it's a really laden term in government and civic tech, because we had it in several contexts there. First is this, I always think of the sort of Uncle Sam World War I recruitment poster, because certainly in the UK in 2012 we had sort of, you know, your government needs you, you know, do your nerd tour of duty, go to government digital service and spend, you know, a few years fixing things, you know, take a break from working at Facebook back when that was not, you know, CV suicide. Yeah. But we also have service as something that a service is something that government delivers in the parlance of government. I was in a very odd meeting the other week with somebody who insisted that government only delivers laws, but it's that kind of, it's the wrapper around the chocolate bar. It's you know, if we're going to go with the metaphor of law as a chocolate bar, you know, it's the thing that makes it sort of noticeable and visible. And I'm wondering if perhaps in this space we want to talk a little bit about what service can mean in both of those contexts.
I think we could almost take a whole hour on that in itself. So I think, you know, I contrasted service to volunteerism because having spent time with both, there's this sort of avocational idea of volunteerism, which is seen by people who come from the volunteer branch of it as actually a strength of that style of civic tech, that these are active private sector technologists doing a little bit of work. And so it's your rather than segmenting your career by a few years spent on a tour of service, you're segmenting your monthly or weekly life with certain hours that you reserve for public sector work. But I think it comes with, and maybe in a bit of an arrogant way, right? Technologists saying, well, I'm just like the people signing up for a tour in the armed forces. I am making sacrifices for my country, and it comes with a lot of kind of patriotic, and especially because it's associated in the US with the national level more than with the local level, where you see more of the volunteerism ethic. I'm contributing to my community, I'm helping my neighbors. They have pretty different just sort of narratives amongst the groups that do them, I think. Do you agree, Andrew?
Yeah, I would say, you know, the service and volunteerism, you know, I see those actually as a contrast, but then they're oftentimes just kind of blurred. And, you know, one thing that's on my mind a lot is, you know, what I see in a lot of spaces is something somewhat transgressive, which is that sometimes civic tech folks are looking at what previously were kind of administrative occupations and saying, well, we can infuse this with sort of the spirit of volunteerism as a way to make it more than just like outsourcing technology for government, you know, like that. And then also kind of, I think it also works the other way in that a lot of volunteers start to sort of think of themselves as involved in service and involved in, you know, kind of embodying a lot of the, you know, identities and ideals of administrators of it and of administrative work. And that, I think you're right, you know, with the bit of arrogance thing. I think it's a little bit of a slippery slope because there's not sort of, if we think in terms of sort of, institutionally, there's not really rules in that space necessarily. And so, one of my takes is that this idea of service and the idea of sort of, infusing administrative work with a spirit of volunteerism, or vice versa, volunteer work with a spirit of, administrative
stewardship and
duty. It actually, I think that's one of the sort of grand experiments. I think that is a kind of a risky and experiment, but it's also something that's, quite interesting to me.
I think, yes. Okay, go ahead, Alex, sorry.
I was just going to say, I'm conscious as well that we're very deep in the context of Civic Tech between the three of us, and it might be worth sort of grounding things with an example of what it is that we mean, both by kind of the kind of projects that we're talking about and the sort of the way that government can react to that. And I was wondering, Cyd, if you wanted to bring in your experience of that.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of great examples from what's been going on with the COVID response, which has occupied obviously a lot of levels and government administrators. So volunteerism, right? Right now in California, we've got a bunch of volunteers who have a lot of web skills, and they're going under the name Vaccinate California. They're calling pharmacies daily to see where COVID vaccines are available, and they're putting them all on a map. So this is the sort of kind of glue commercially available technology that Civic Tech volunteerism groups often use and deploy to fill a gap often that government isn't doing. The government is not doing a good job of getting people to where the shops are available. Earlier in the pandemic, we saw a much more institutional volunteer response by journalists from The Atlantic and a large staff of volunteers at this point to create the COVID tracking project. And both of these, I think, are interesting because they are ostensibly technology projects, but they rely on pretty basic off-the-shelf technology plus a lot of volunteer muscle. Then you see people perhaps from one of the national digital services. So here that's USDS modeled on GDS or 18F, perhaps working with CDC to do data projects. And we had a very political example in the state of Florida where one of the data scientists was fired for her insistence on publishing COVID data in a way that made very clear to the public what was going on. So that's, that fits for me into very traditional service models. She had a career civil service job. She was fired. She talked to the press. That's a sort of mechanism that we all recognize as whistleblowing or resigning in protest or something like that. The national services here do things like redesign the immigration forms for people who are trying to get through the US immigration or eventually naturalization process. The municipal and local ones often are more sort of gap filling. Can be anything. And there are some specific ones that have come up in response to the pandemic just to help under-resourced government agencies hold interviews remotely or hold court hearings remotely. I've been working with the California court system, and so we see a lot of scrambling on the part of officials to get some of that in place. And there's a lot to do because, of course, our previous federal administration, gosh, there's a lot of colorful terms I can use, but didn't get it done on COVID response.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on that, if you were done with were you done with your thought?
I think that was yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think those are all really good examples, and I actually personally have trouble keeping up with all the examples of sort of what's going on with different projects, in the US and elsewhere. Yeah, I think there are a lot of fascinating examples in different sort of spheres. I think for me, sort of the uniting thread is governance. Whether it's kind of collectively done or institutionally done. And so, for me, I think, particularly the, economic downturn around, 2008 was sort of a, and a lot of the cuts made at the local level was, I mean, that I think was a really big driver of a lot of interest in civic tech, at least in the United States, from what I can tell, because you did have these spaces open up that, government simply didn't have sort of the time to do a lot of the things that, wasn't explicitly in its wheelhouse, right? And so they sort of took a look and said, well, some of this stuff is nice, but, we don't have to do all of that. And I do think there is an advantage to sort of these, in these examples of like groups being able to work semi-autonomously from the state. So, in a lot of cases, and I think, Alex is right, it's like not all cases, there is an interesting relationship kind of between, these organizations and groups in the state and sort of the work that they do or can do, and how that's kind of slightly different from, again, slightly transgressive, slightly sort of administrative work, but
that's right. I mean, I think, we see early, sorry to interrupt, early civic tech groups, right, pride themselves on not being part of government and not even having close partnerships, and eventually discovering as they get into more life critical areas that maybe it would be a good idea to have partnerships, and how those groups have shifted their posture from, a little bit more like advocacy groups that are trying to hold the government accountable and provide something that it doesn't, to groups that partner more closely. And I think that's a particularly interesting shift, tension.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like where the idea of civic hacking sort of first came from, one of the first, folks that I sort of tracked it to is James Crabtree in 2007, really, thinking about it very much in a model of like e-democracy, but there wasn't a real sort of institutional dimension to what he was thinking about. I mean, it was fairly libertarian, in my opinion. It was sort of looking to new platforms and sort of, saying, well, these are the places for new forms of collectivity to emerge, and so, and I think this was very much, the thinking, 15 years ago, so far as like online platform, we can sort of.
This is Web 2.0 feeding into the Tim O'Reilly and Carl Malamud Gov 2.0, right?
Yeah, and wisdom of crowds and CyraWiki, and a lot of these.
Just make a platform. If you build it, they will build apps on it.
Yeah, and so honestly, like I'm way more attentive to like the ideas that stick these days a little bit more than like the projects, just because I get so exhausted about tracking every single project, and that, unfortunately, well, for better or for worse, this is something like people expect of me now, and I'm like totally exhausted from like tracking all these projects. I just I just look at what other people have done at this point.
Right. I think the Civic Hall folks with the Civic Tech Field Guide do admirable work on that, probably better than anybody else.
Yeah, exactly.
The Civic Tech graveyard section is just I'll put it in the chat for those who are following along, but there's a wonderful I think it's a Google sheet of every project that has failed, and a relatively decent obituary for why it failed, because there's so much of this that's about, I feel that, I think going back to that point there about the sort of libertarian Web 2.0 stuff, certainly with the UK context, you have this sort of, no one was intending to build critical national infrastructure as a hobby, and then they suddenly discover that this thing that they were doing that was sort of thumbing their nose at government becomes something much more is important. And I don't know, it's like a sort of, it's almost like it's got a sort of Pixar film, everyone has a learning moment thing, and everyone's politics grow up a little bit. It's sort of the vibe I get from it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And this is sort of one of my I sort of have a, there is a certain this is going to be a little inside baseball, but this is Oxford, so I assume this is like, okay. You know, there's a certain sort of strand of critical scholars who really feel a need to, like, you know, rewrite the California ideology, you know, again, like rewrite that book again. And I think what that misses is, like, you know, the point that, you know, Lily Irani and other anthropologists who do ethnography have sort of made, which is that, you know, we need to be maybe more attentive to, you know, why these ideas take hold in certain situations and how they're put into action. Because that, you know, I really do think that people, of course, have agency in terms of their politics and how they sort of involve themselves in these projects. Yeah, so I do think it is really interesting. And you know, in the US, you know, one of the, you know, just as maybe a comparative point to the UK is that, you know, I was kind of surprised that, you know, even an organization like Code for America didn't really have the idea for brigades, you know, from the start, which is really their, you know, claim to being grassroots. It's their kind of decentralized organizational structure, and what makes them Code for America and not Code for California. And what, in my opinion, makes them, you know, far more than, you know, enables them to make sort of claims to, you know, the public good, you know, and they came from that very same stew, you know, like Web 2.0, platform stuff, Gov 2.0.
Everyone at Code for America in 2013 had the thing on their desk that said JFDI, right?
Yeah.
Just fucking do it. I hope it's okay to drop an F-bomb at Oxford, but that, you know, just get it done. And I've been meditating a lot recently. I was actually on Twitter late last night, posting a thread in response to a question from some smart technologists who are like, why can't they just make the vaccine signups good? And the whole, sometimes I think, you know, in the way that Paul Ford says that why wasn't I consulted is the fundamental question of the web, that the fundamental question of civic tech is why can't they just, whatever it is. Yeah, and, you know, we started with sort of, well, they can't just because people aren't willing to do it. You know, there's a sort of bureaucratic hesitation and ambivalence to move forward. And I think most people who get involved in the work for a few years start to recognize where that comes from and why in some ways it's a healthy thing, or, you know, there are many, many things that are restrictions that are there for good reasons or what were once good reasons, and how to work around them. And it starts to conflict with the idea, which is very strong in US civic tech, that this isn't political. And you made a very good point, Alex, that there's a, you know, there's a micropolitics of every version of this, but there's a strong statement from still a lot of people who do this work. Well, it's not political at all. It's just technocratic. It's just about administration. And I think it can hold more easily, although very uneasily still, if you're confined to the executive branch and service delivery. But when you start thinking about things like elections or things like courts or things that are really more about rights than just this sort of consumer relationship with the government that's possible to construct for executive branch services, again, with that word where budget is expended, value of some kind is delivered to constituents of some kind, sometimes without interrogating too closely which constituents get it, and so forth. You can obscure from yourself, and a lot of technologists want to, the idea that, you know, you are involved in a project to fundamentally shift the way that centuries-old institutions relate to their members. So it has to be politics.
I think that's a really interesting part of it as well. And I keep coming back to, there were some posts, again, yeah, unfortunately, my kind of canon for this is very, very UK centric, but like after GDS was set up, you've got this kind of, this burst of blogging and all these people going, you know, with the fundamental question, why can't we just fix the UK government with a couple of cloud hosted servers and some Python? And then you get this sort of start of a sort of ecosystem of critical blogs, and one of them's from Lisa Reichelt, who ended up being their head of user research, kind of going, you haven't considered a single aspect of the social implications of what you're doing. And she absolutely demolishes the work that they've done early on in this sort of transformation, you know, jeans and hoodies, great, you know, JFDI, great. And I sometimes think of it, ethnography, in these sorts of institution versus technology things, as like WD-40 between two really unpleasant layers. I've had so many conversations about this politics thing as well, because it's something that keeps, I mean, in the current moment, bubbling up, and it's impossible to ignore. There's something about not just the politics of, with ethnography, you could be working on a regular thing that happens in central government, I think, is that you could be working as a design ethnographer. So you're not exactly doing ethnography of 18 months in the field, although one could suggest that if you have an 18-month contract, that is essentially field work, because you're doing ethnography of the service delivery just as much as the people who are being helped, sort of. But you might be doing something that is actively harmful. You might be, if you'd been working for the US administration, you might have been working on kids in cages, or, some program that facilitated that happening. In the UK, you might be working on deportations that send people back to countries where they are absolutely going to be killed. And that is there's a strange cognitive dissonance, because there's a lot of people who go, I'm building something with some CSS, or, we're working really hard to get the button placement right. And then there's this kind of wave of social and sort of qualitative information that disrupts this carefully constructed bubble distance, like cognitive dissonance. There we go. That's the phrase people use for this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, when I was in 18F, which I joined in May of 2016, thinking, well, it'll be fun to see a presidential transition as a federal employee, and got a lot more than I bargained for on that front. There was a big difference in how the two national agencies responded. So US Digital Service, which is closely associated with the White House, had this sort of, some people decided to really dig in, get through, and serve. 18F, which is associated with the General Service Administration, which is a very administrative agency, and until Emily Murphy decided not to send that letter during this transition, nobody would have thought of it as a political place. And so the recruiting flopped. The digital service had been more prestigious, and 18F started to have an easier time recruiting because it was sort of seen as, well, this isn't involved in all the administration politics. And I had a lot of conversations with colleagues there about red lines and so forth. What do we know we would leave if we were asked to do? Over the couple of years that my term continued, is there value in, for example, helping the Department of the Interior lose gracefully when the administration withdraws from environmental treaties? Is there value in using our skills to help mitigate the damage of a big loss? And I think it really varies by the person. So you get some people who see themselves as civic technologists who really can't work if they're not politically aligned with the government that they're working for. And then you get people who are, have red lines, but maybe feel okay about, as you say, providing them. Frictions between, an institutional shock and a bureaucracy that does something, maybe through trying to understand both in contexts. And I don't think the field as a whole has reckoned with all of that in a group way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. I remember, again, when Trump was elected, I think I was watching, I was actually essentially, I didn't, this is a funny story. I don't know if I've told this, but, I did some crowdfunding for my book, and I neglected to realize that the deadline for my Kickstarter overlapped with the end of the presidential election. And so that was really interesting, because I was hyper attuned to, the message that I was sort of promoting, and sort of how I had shaped this book up till that point to capture a certain moment. And also kind of, I don't know, sort of had mixed feelings about, because, I think if, Hillary was elected, it would be very much business as usual. And, this book may not actually ultimately be that interesting, because there wasn't really much of a, tension. In politics is all about power, all about, the tensions that power brings. Yeah, so I think it's a much maybe more interesting space right now. I think, the question of sort of alignment is very important. There's a good book I always come back to, which is by Meyerson, and it's just called Tempered Radicals. And and it's really about this idea that there are ways of being kind of political, even in contexts that are very institutionally binding. People still have agency. They still can perform advocacy roles, for instance. They still can even back to the idea of people soldiering and sort of dragging their feet and like deciding, well, I don't know if this is really worth our time. There's a lot of ways that, down to on the one end of the spectrum is like actual collective action inside of institutions, right? And so I actually think there's a range of sort of ways of, talking about, agency in these spaces. And, I think actually that conversation is way more interesting than sometimes what I hear is like some kind of version of like, hey, this stuff is kind of bogus. People are coerced and they don't have any, ability to move in this space. And that's actually not really what I'm seeing on the ground. I think there is an interesting conversation about ways that, people come together, and Cyd, like you're saying, I think a lot of the ways that people think about these things are very hyper individual, because people are coming from, at this point, so many different backgrounds. It's really not just engineers. In a lot of the organizations, even like Code for American Brigades and other organizations like it, in different countries, there's a lot of turnover. So like what an organization is in 2016 is not what an organization is in 2021, just because naturally to keep going, organizations have to change. And so, I think paying attention to, moments of change, these tensions, which can be individual, is actually an inroad and an invitation to think about a more expansive set, of politics than, if you're looking at from a very high level, you might presume would be possible.
I'm aware we've just got some questions in the Q&A. So I feel like Diego, we might have started to answer your question there about managing the micropolitics and ethnographic research for Civic Technology. I think that's that. Just to build on what you were saying there, Andrew, there's a quote that I think I bore people to death with, which is from one of Diana Forsyth's books, and it starts with the word anthropologists, but we may as well read user researchers. And it's anthropologists who study up in their own society need to be aware of the following facts of life. If you publish things about powerful people that they do not agree with, they will not necessarily like it. Unless they are people of great generosity, and there certainly are such people, they may not wish you to continue to write more of the same. This may affect your career. And I think that's the, some of the management of being certainly a paid user researcher in these situations is that you are managing your contractual relationship in the same way, I think, as if you were an ethnographer in the field. You can't just publish something saying this is stupid or this doesn't work or whatever. You find where the levers of power are in that situation and you try and chip away at it. But I do think this possibly comes to the question that we have about like, and I think it's a nice, big, expansive, unanswerable question of like, if you find that a democratically elected government is pursuing a policy that is incompatible with people, like that everybody you research with goes, this, I don't know, knocks out my way of life, or this is, this makes me feel concerned for my future, or, like when you find that it doesn't there's a tension here, because we're talking about micro democracy, and sometimes user researchers cast themselves as sort of the voice of the user. In fact, that's how they are constructed in these places, to be sort of the tribune of the plebs within a product team, but they're not. But that kind of goes down its own weird populism route as well, and is especially in the governments. I mean, I don't have any problem with this in Facebook, because I mean they need some voice, but like it doesn't have that same. The power you're fighting is notionally democratic. And David, we'll get to your question in just a moment.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. When I started, trying to formulate design, sort of overarching design values for Civic Tech back around 2011 or so, I think I had, had respect for people's time and dignity and abilities, and encouraging participation. And I had this idea of unity, because I had actually been to a lecture by someone who was from the sort of school of thinking about government you were mentioning, where it's a power dynamic and a power dynamic alone, and it is the people against the government. And I thought, this doesn't feel democratic, even if it expresses a side of it, but it also exposes, why don't we treat everybody who comes to apply for food benefits as one of the owners of the shop here? Why don't we afford them, the kind of care and respect and care about what they think, as if, the owner walks into the restaurant and just wants to have dinner there that night. So it gets very complicated.
Yeah, I would say I'm, so I've already admitted I am absolutely like not a designer by trade. And so I'm very much used to coming in as a communication person and sort of interpreting design ideas using, communication theories, and more or less stomping all over design. That said, I really do like a lot of what design is trying to do, but yeah, I have this same sort of, I don't know, again, like the slippery slope of what designers are and claim to do. I mean, it can very much literally, become, the worst kind of, authoritarianism, where, one person kind of embodies, the good of the people, even though they don't exactly maybe resemble them or understand their ideas. And so, I think that sort of idea about, and then it becomes more complex too, because in many countries, there's simply not formalized democratic institutions for technology design. And so a lot of folks are sort of just like, and on that level, I'm like, yeah, like if you're redesigning how, I don't know, the Department of Motor Vehicles works, or service delivery for, government food assistance, or like SNAP benefits, or, or WIC, those sorts of things. I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, it's, you could improve that, but I think there is this thing that happens where, unless we sort of build and progress to the point where it's becoming more than just piecemeal work, it's not going to actually be ever more democratic than it currently is, which is sometimes in a very kind of confused space.
Yeah, so two things to your point. I mean, I think we in this conversation have been having some really rich discussions about the ethnography of the institutions, but that is not embodied in the role of a design researcher typically, right? It's always the users that are to be studied. The institution is this kind of opaque player that's taken for granted. And then just thinking about, I participated in a study last summer that Dana Chisnell led, which was about what it actually was like as an experience to be trying to get unemployment benefits in the US during the pandemic. And the collection of institutional players, it was funded by a foundation, a policy foundation that has close contacts to people in Capitol Hill, and so was in touch with legislative staff members and so forth. And then we did a story-based style of research, so just trying to, in a very open-ended way, have these hour and a half conversations with people about what, how did they come to be out of work? Why were they staying home? Were they forced to be at work? What people were they interacting with? What systems were they interacting with? How was it going? What was the overall effect on their psyche and their family life and their perception of themselves as a productive member of society? And then the paths through which to bring that, the results of that research, which I'll put a link in the after event summary if people are interested. How does that then get turned into policy is something that I think sort of public sector ethnography, or mini ethnography, as you might call something that took place over that short a time, hasn't really solved. I think people have a good idea of like, how do we turn it into a better interface? But a lot of what came out of that study was these systems were designed to keep people from getting the benefits. They were designed to make sure that nobody who was ineligible didn't get them. And when the pandemic happened, not only did the technical systems fall over because they were under-resourced and the peak was 10 times above anything they'd anticipated, the sort of business rules behind them also fell over because they didn't apply, and there were no easy ways for the states, and these are individual 50 states that maintain these rules. There was no easy way for the states to adapt those business rules fast without a sort of legislative deliberative process, or at least a regulatory and guidance deliberative process. And if they did, there was no way to re-embed new business rules into the not very well constructed technology systems that were the main interface and source of friction between the public and these vital programs. And so I think it did a bit of good, but less than I think the team would have hoped.
I'd quite like just to pick off David's question at the top of the Q&A there about, I know, Andrew, you're going to get Terence's question, but do you call for tech for political organizing a kind of civic tech, like online mobilizing militia members to invade the capital, or anti-civic tech? And certainly from my perspective, there was a couple of years ago, I went to a Civic Tech conference, and the main speakers were like Brazilian Civic Tech people whose entire thing is like tech to resist Bolsonaro on almost every level. And you go, oh, politics, right? Like big letter politics. But I often wonder if there's something relatively, and this might kind of chip into Terence's question as well, about there's something inherently liberal to left wing about civic tech, like
while pretending to be apolitical, right?
Yeah. There's implicit politics we don't talk about, because if we did talk about it, we'd all have to sing the Internationale.
Something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I just explicitly, don't think civic tech, like you can't break down sort of, all right, technology has politics, certainly, but I don't think civic tech as an idea, and as an idea that's sort of produced by people, digested in different organizational contexts and implemented in different institutions, can be reduced to necessarily just the technology, and so this is where I actually love a lot of science and technology studies literature, and I love sort of STS stuff and Langdon Winter, but I feel like if we dwell maybe too much on that, it can potentially be unhelpful. So and this is where I think, frankly, a lot of civic tech folks sometimes trip over their feet, and they do make the claim, for instance, that and James Crabtree did this explicitly, right? Like these online platforms like Facebook is civic technology, right? Like I don't hear too many people making that claim in 2021. Funny. But I think that's really just because we've sort of learned that technology is what you make of it.
Right.
And so again, for me, I think there is that said, the way people think about technology, not just like the technology itself is sort of like, hey, it's technology, here it is, come and get it. you know, the way people think about technology is, you know, always kind of changing. And so it will, you know, the idea of using technology for the public good, you know, that idea changes, you know, over time. And so, you know, very much in the same way that, you know, the idea of democracy, as, you know, Raymond Williams said, slides all over the place, you know, so too does Civic Tech. And I'm sure I don't have any examples, you know, on hand, although I do keep up with a lot of the, you know, Parlay hot takes and screenshots. I'm sure there's someone out there saying that, you know, right-wing platforms are essentially, you know, a form of Civic Tech, in that they are a public good, that they are, you know, so, you know, it's a difficult question, but I think I tend to just dodge it by, you know, focusing on organizing and institutions and other things other than merely just sort of the technology itself.
I think I've seen a fairly hard line among civic technologists that, you know, for example, campaign tech doesn't really count in the civic tech space.
Why is, can I just say, like, why is that? Like, that seems to be like a low hanging fruit, but somehow like everybody is kind of fascinated with like procurement reform, and like, it's like, why is that, Cyd? I'm just gonna hijack the whole thing and just make it about like, questions I have that I can't answer.
I think it has a lot to do with the sort of, you know, the centering in this idea of technology as apolitical, and campaigns are obviously explicitly not just political, but partisan. I think also there was a play, you know, early in the 2010s to try and get this kind of left-right thing going. And when I worked at Code for America, Eric Cantor, one of the leadership of the House of Representatives, who was very right-wing Republican, came by, and we were really happy about that, because it was sort of, we're showing that, you know, technology is something that people can come together on, that, you know, that doesn't require us to negotiate some of the same differences that other things do. And so the sort of funding depended on it. People had this identity, and so it was just, you know, all that work around campaigns. And it was odd because then, you know, when Obama needed to rescue the healthcare.gov site, right, he called a lot of the smart technologists who had worked on his campaign. And when we saw the debacle with the Iowa caucus last year, that was actually a group that was very Civic Tech aligned, that had created that. So that was maybe technically election tech, but election tech has always been in the circle for the sort of election administration side. So yeah, I think it's a wall that may break because it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I think it's been put there pretty consciously by people who are trying to see technology as a neutral player.
I often wondered if it had anything to do with the sort of Project Narwhal, or I think that was what it was, the Obama tech in 2008 that was, you know, the sort of management for contacting volunteers and, you know, really getting out the vote. But like, you find this sort of blog post from the period, and it's all about, oh, we'll make this open source once the election's done. And here we are in 2021, and it is nowhere. And it's an interesting thing of like the co-option of the language of like, yes, come and work on this campaign, and when it's done, it will be open source and it will become part of the commons.
The infrastructure.
But there's something, there's something about kind of politics.
Did it this time, actually. But I don't know that there's anybody on those repos now, and I think that's one of the things that makes campaign tech a tricky place to build a field, is that it's episodic. The campaigns that really have a scale where you would get a bunch of technologists working on these large apps are the national ones, and those are, you know, every 2 to 4 years, as opposed to, and most local campaigns for mayor or something don't involve a lot of that fancy call tech and contact management.
Yeah.
Do you fancy covering Terence's point, and then me and Cyd can stew on Peter's point?
Yeah, I think I'd love to, you know, answer this, you know, or I don't know, not
Yeah,
answer this
this is
question, or
important.
at least talk about this question as like, a panel of white folks, or at least I assume we're all white folks here. I'm like every kind of white except for, British, sorry. I do think, there is a challenge. One of the central challenges of civic tech is this challenge of representation, and how we think about representation, and how we represent, people in a lot of the services that, government produces and ostensibly serves wider swaths of people other than the people who produce them. So yeah, I mean, I think, clearly if you produce, if you just bring relatively homogenous, privileged folks into spaces, where design work is happening, that can be a serious problem. That said, I think one thing I've seen a lot in sort of, the academic community is there's been a lot of people like Sophia Noble who are really pushing past, I would say, where a lot of like educational institutions are, so far as, as the phrase goes, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and thinking about, well, how do we actually, institutionalize a lot of these changes? So, a lot of the burden isn't just placed on people who embody, certain aspects of diversity, race, gender, whether they're queer or not, in these spaces. We're not constantly just asking them to sort of do diversity work. And that's, I think that's a really, vital question. And so, I think I had a hard time sort of articulating my ambivalence about, this idea that, if we simply import folks that, represent the people who, should be served by technology, into those design processes, a lot of the time that's simply not enough either. It's just really not. And I've, just in my own work, I've seen a lot of examples of, design practices that are perfectly fine and well-meaning, but really end up being a different kind of advocacy work where, the products and the outcomes of, design work, whether there's user stories, images of the people themselves, or the paths that users go through, end up being somewhat reductive, and end up being sort of used in ways that actually doesn't do justice to the, issues that people are actually experiencing on the ground. And so, even if they are produced, for instance, by Black and brown people in institutional settings, and that's a more difficult kind of, question. And it's a tough question, but I think, one of the things that I kind of come back to, is that, procedure isn't necessarily anti-democratic, right? And so, I think we've seen that this in the United States over the last 4 years is like, one of the things that really, frankly, saved us is that, Trump couldn't just sort of wreck everything because he was, very distractible, and so, a lot of these institutional structures and ways of doing things, not just laws and not just institutions, but practices, even like weird norms that, every time I wake up, I feel like I'm reading a story about, a near disaster that almost happened. I think we need to start institutionalizing, and thinking about, how kind of best practices to, not just for design work, but the way that design work is recognized and has a higher position of power in institutional settings. That's, a lot of the time, this is one of the fundamental, sorry, this is sort of a rant question. This is like a rant response, but, you know, a lot of the ways that I see folks sort of, oh crap, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, I guess I'll end there. Sorry, I had a culminating example, but it just went right out of my head. But I think this is sort of the, you know, the right question to ask, and it's certainly not reducible to you know, bringing people of, you know, lower socioeconomic status, Black and brown people, queer folks, into these organizational and institutional settings. That said, that's not a terrible place to start, but it shouldn't sort of be the
Right.
you know, the culminating point. You know, so you know, we can't just sort of have a diversity committee or have a you know, readout of how many, you know, of demographics in our educational institutions or organizations and have that be like, you know, a check
Are we winning?
mark and be like, well, we solved it. All right, we're
Yeah.
gonna move on. I mean, for me, the proof is in the pudding, and you know, it's really about, you know, how much you know, folks' lives are actually you know, improved, and a focus on outcomes as well as sort of, you know, representation.
I do think one thing that happens in Civic Tech specifically with people going into government from a technologist position is that at least in the United States, government is a lot more representative of the population than the technology industry is. That's not to say it's by any means perfect, but it's much more likely that a career civil servant will be a Black woman than that a senior technologist will. And so if you bring in the senior technologist and you look at the fact that there's a sort of, it's not inherent, it's constructed, but there is a privilege of being a technologist right now is that you're presumed to be smart, active, industrious. And I think there's an opposite idea sometimes about people who work in government. And so you get situations where the privilege of looking like a technologist and also looking like a majority person gets you a lot more voice in a setting where you're having one of these, you know, actual on the ground interactions between government and civil service folks. And perspectives of civil service folks get excluded because, you know, there's just more likelihood that you're looking there at a minority person. You've also got this sort of weight of, well, government people are probably lazy and don't know how to do things because we've seen that government stuff doesn't always work, and technology industry is full of brilliant people who know how to do things. Civic technologists who allow that to slide by end up missing a lot of you know, important information about history. And history isn't something that we talk about a lot. Sort of, I don't know, technology isn't thought to have history, but most of the time I've gone into a government to work on a technology project, I find it's on its third or fourth try. And unearthing what happened and why it didn't work and whether the conditions have changed in a way that it might be able to succeed this time is a really important part of the research work that has nothing to do with users up front. But if the voices of those civil service folks who don't see themselves as technologists, and I like to question this because I often run into civil service folks, you know, like somebody I met in the city of Oakland, California, who said, oh yeah, I'm not tech savvy, I really can't do this stuff. I said, oh yeah, you know, I know it's hard for all of us. Show me a little bit about how you do what you do with the CMS, which we were looking at. She said, well, you know, I have to go into this interface and then I have to open this other screen and then actually I have to get into the code because this thing is broken. So I go in here and I fix the HTML and I do this and then I verify it over here and then I work around this part of the system because it doesn't work and I've actually hacked it to use this. But yeah, it sucks because I'm not technology savvy. And so, you know, you have people who don't claim that and are more likely to be minority people, and people who are there because they are claiming that and are more likely to be majority people. And I actually think it's a pretty important dynamic in civic tech. And I do think it's a problem. And I think it's a problem that it's really hard work for early career folks to do too. I keep having to say to people who are just finishing an undergraduate degree, this is hard if you are 23 because, you know, the technology stuff isn't that hard, but the exercising influence is really difficult and takes advanced level skills.
Yeah.
It's possibly beyond the scope of today, but I think there's a talk up from one of the Code for America conferences by Abby Koss about like imperialism and colonialism in this space, and I know I can see some familiar faces on the list here, so some of them will remember Abby from when she was in London, but like it's something that keeps playing on my head, around my head, is like,
Yeah.
we often have this discussion between sort of the UK and the US about civic tech, and some of the stuff about throwing this as open source is often back to the kind of austerity logic, is going, if we give this to poorer countries, they can use it, completely ignoring local circumstances, completely ignoring global voices, going, we in our infinite wisdom and our universal political systems gift you our institutional neuroses expressed as code and research.
Behold. Yeah.
Yeah. And we refuse to learn from, you know, it's something that is very obscured in the US, that actually the coronavirus response in Vietnam has been amazing. We don't talk about it because obviously we're leading. And I think, you know, it goes to what we were talking about a little earlier about political. There are some organizations that I think could fit very easily into civic tech in the US that, for example, were started by groups of Black designers in St. Louis following the Ferguson riots. And they're about decolonizing design, they're about activism, they're about creating things that are better. But in core civic tech, like, oh, that, you know, that's explicitly political. And I think that many people from those communities don't see themselves as having the option to not be political. And so if we sort of fence, you know, doing civic tech or doing government work to places at least where the politics can be under the surface, that's another site of exclusion.
Mm.
Shall we have a go at Peter's question here? If sometimes projects get interred in the civic tech graveyard because a government decided it should do it. Sometimes that's even the goal of the project. How have the panelists found that people respond to that kind of change? I mean, in my Space of Democracy Club, I think we're waiting desperately for government to nationalise us, but I'm always interested in examples where that's actually happened.
I hope that most people respond to that as a win. I've seen people take it both ways. Sometimes it's like, well, the government didn't do it as well, or, you know, now government is involved and we're not going to be able to move as fast. But we've also seen the downsides of, you know, whether for profit or not, privatizing actual government functions. And you know, what happens when you have models where the government can't make requirements about equity, or because there's no accountability because it's free and it's an open source thing, and so there it is, you can use it, or where you know, where a group of open source maintainers have made something really great but don't have a way to respond to maintenance problems. Can a government really take that in and make it part of its core set of services? Well, probably not. So then, you know, do you encourage commercialization, or do you bring it inside a government? And if it's at the local level and you bring it inside one government, what does that mean for the other 20,000 local governments in the US, and whether they're able to take advantage of it?
I know I brought this up when I was chatting to you last year, but one of the things that always sticks in my head with this is parliamentary reporting in the UK, like that it was a sort of parasitical thing where, you know, it wasn't originally Thomas Hansard, but eventually it was Thomas Hansard sitting up there with a notepad, making notes. When he got prosecuted for verbatim reporting, he changed the names of the MPs and published them as satirical plays, and eventually it just becomes a department, and they dress it up as like, we're going to sell the output of this data and you can buy Hansard, and then no one's buying Hansard. They go, fine, it's open data. And it's this sort of 150-year-long journey from pamphlets to a shonky XML feed. But like, there's something really interesting about like I totally see what you're saying, Cyd, because there's so many projects I've seen like that. But I think sometimes the blocker in the head is like that we can't get a developer team, or we can't get sysops to keep the code running, even though the idea perfectly well sits within a kind of inside government space.
Yeah, and that's one of the difficulties is that there's an assumption a lot of the time that government has, all the resources that a private sector company would have and more in terms of, digital tools and staff who are familiar with, and that there's a reason that personnel has been a big part of this whole movement and field. And I have some hesitations about calling it a movement, but nonetheless, right, it's few governments are staffed for a really active, modern digital presence of any sort, let alone a transactional one. And so the implications of bringing it in come into government budgets and, which is public money. And I don't have a very good answer. I'm gonna try throwing it to Andrew and see if he's got more to say.
Not really. I am thrilled that the phrase Civic Tech graveyard is like has like other people use that phrase, because I use that phrase all the time, because there is quite an extensive it's quite a large graveyard at this point, and it's to the point where we a lot of folks really are rebuilding the wheel. And I think it's also an example of like, sometimes these ideas sound good and they sort of, again, sort of the way that technology is sort of viewed as a solution and as a, something that has claims associated with it. Sometimes it can actually purport to solve, problems that actually for people in power are not particularly problems at all. One of the examples that I use from time to time is from, I live in Long Beach, California, and, we had some techies here at one point who were working on a project that basically mapped repeat users or heavy users of emergency services.
You're talking about the Code for America Fellowship from 2014?
Cyd, I'm trying to somewhat anonymize this, but yes, and it was actually a perfectly great idea. And the idea was really that, and it's particular to Long Beach because we have a very strong relationship between local government and the healthcare community, in particular healthcare companies in Southern California. And so, they were really interested in kind of figuring out, kind of producing an app that would actually map and detect and collect where emergency services are most heavily used. So of course, sort of the one of the basic problems was, of course, just the question of privacy, right?
Yeah.
But I think the real question and the real challenge, in my opinion, was that the idea was for this application to be used for, and again, this is just my understanding. Someone might have the real scoop or something. But it was my understanding that it was produced for people in who were police, who were working in
first
fire,
responders, I think, were the intended users.
And
yeah.
And so what ended up happening, I mean, for one thing, there is one person in North Long Beach who calls 911 several times a day, and so it ends up not being an app that's useful for people on the ground who are first responders, because they know where they're going every single damn day. And it's not useful for government officials because it stigmatizes someone who, may have other underlying issues they need to work out, maybe, with, a therapist or something. But it's not like a technological problem. And so, there's, I think we're now in a place where it's very obvious that a lot of technological solutions, are for kind of more fundamental underlying, social and political problems. But, a corollary of that is that, a lot of these apps are just sort of, sent off to die because nobody uses them. They actually don't serve the intended purpose. They actually don't even have a utility. The sort of the spectacle of their use and the idea of their use has a utility at certain times in organizations and institutions, but that's different from on the ground day-to-day, when they're being used. And sometimes there's a really big disconnect between those things. And so, it's really interesting for me to sort of, if we do rummage about in the Civic Tech graveyard, one activity that, you might want to just punt to an enterprising, PhD student or something would be to do, an unearthing of the Civic Tech graveyard and sort of to use that as a starting point for, some of the stories like the one that I told. It's just, getting to the point where you fully understand why something fails is not as simple as, oh, it was, technology, and it was trying to fix a social problem. That's maybe the starting point. The actual reason why it didn't work is sometimes more tortured and complex.
Just want to come in briefly on Juliana's question in the Q&A, which is about sort of citizen use of technology to combat racism and other forms of historical injustice. There's just one example in my head that I'd like to just say, and then I'll throw it back. And we've also got a question in the panel, so we'll need to probably keep responses relatively brief. There was student protests about 2010, going back in the midst of time, just as the new coalition government came in the UK, and the police tactic at the time was kettling. So lots of twisty streets in London, block each exit with police, sit you there for 6 hours, no food, no water, no toilets, and you get a very enjoyable afternoon. There was a very quickly spun up app, mobile web app, where you could report where the police were as a protester, so that if you were trying to get through London quickly and get to your protest spot and then keep moving, you could evade kettles. And it was fantastic. And it sprung up and it disappeared again because it was solving this really specifically created problem. And it was, it was right at the point where people had smartphones that could do this, like right at the early point where you could expect high adoption. And I think the tools were relative, it was at the point where that felt possible to do. And I sometimes wonder if the sort of do we have the space of political possibility within creating technology feels less sometimes. I wonder, and I think like the police taking photos of police violence is a really interesting comparator, because you take a photo of police violence and you put it on Facebook. You don't put it on OpenStreetMap as a layer of where police violence has happened.
Well, you have some, institutional interveners in there, right? So the American Civil Liberties Union, which is a pretty important non-governmental organization here, made a version to stream your video directly to their servers if you see police violence or if you're part of a protest. And I think that the Hong Kong protesters over the last couple of years have been very tech enabled and used a lot of the tools that we would think of as core Civic Tech tools, like mapping layers and such. But then, yes, Facebook is there, and we've already talked about whether Facebook is Civic Tech, which is hard to say it is, but if you
squint, you can make it.
Yeah, you can make it fit, and it's an important part of the affordances that citizens have to communicate with each other and organize. So I don't know if Civic Tech is about the motivation or the outcome.
Yeah. I mean, to me, this maybe, you'd have to maybe think about, to decolonize design, to think, yeah, I don't know if, sort of end use would necessarily be enough to, I would love to see some more of these ideas actually feed back up into, the design cycle. And I know there's a lot of folks who are, focus on decolonization and think about that quite a bit. I'd love to see this be not just a question of like end use, right? Because there is a limit to technology appropriation, right? And the ways that communities who have been historically disenfranchised can appropriate technology in different ways to move from a low position of power to a high position of power. I mean, that's sort of, English's sort of typical thing. It's not just that they're reusing technology or hacking technology, it's that they're appropriating it for, expressly to gain more political power, to gain, and so, I think that's good, but that may be, there may be limits to that. And I think you see that, particularly with platforms like, Twitter, Facebook, sort of the larger platforms, which are now sort of becoming sort of de facto institutions, informal institutions, something. You can reuse these services to, try to, put pressure on the powers that be, but, there's a limit to that, and so you still have, folks who are deemed at different, points by these platforms to be, objectionable, whether it's, sex workers or trans folks, or, Twitter not really responding to, racist threats at the same rate as other types of threats. That to me sort of doesn't tell me that we've decolonized anything.
I'm just going to throw over to David on the panelists if you want to ask your question.
Thank you. This is more of a kind of general reflection on the discussion, which has been fascinating. I've been particularly taken by some of the almost mismatches between what Alex has been saying and what the other two have been saying, and it's kind of versions of the old, divided by a common language theme, and it really goes to the general issue is the problem of using English as its own meta language. And for us, I suppose this is particularly Alex, when he takes off his Civic Technologist hat and puts on his I'm writing a doctorate hat, he has a problem of trying to think analytically about the words being used by civic technologists, which are the same words. And that can get immensely problematic when we have words like political, like service, like volunteer, like technology, actually, as we just had this thing about if some kind of projects labeled as being about decolonization, which you're saying, well, actually, are these civic technology or not? And I mean, the things I keep going back to are ideas like essentially contested concepts, wicked problems, and kind of merging the two wicked concepts. And it's just so hard to keep distinct and clear in your own mind, in one's own mind, whether an idea or a concept is the term of analysis or the thing being analyzed. And that's a problem for us all, but I think particularly for when you are working in English, particularly when working on a group of people who are immensely self-reflexive and self-critical. And what we need is a clear and separate analytical vocabulary. I know we'll never get one, but I think it's my job as someone slightly on the outside to keep reminding us of these two distinct poles. And I'll shut up and let you all respond.
Yeah, the big problem with anthropologists getting hired by government is we just take these concepts and then mercilessly apply them to business.
Yeah, I don't know if Alex has that problem. I have that problem too. It's a problem maybe if you're an academic thinking about how analytically you're going to unpack and critique a particular, object or object of study. And I get the sort of, drowning in your own kind of soup thing. But I think a lot of folks who work, I think two things come to mind is that it's actually, to me, signals that there are actual, things to discuss that we are reaching for and we can't quite grasp. I think that's actually a fantastically good thing. And I know I, in my own, writing have, written, entire books that I now look back on and think differently about. And you simply sort of learn from the experience and move on. I think that's part of the process. The other thing is that I think, to sort of think about civic tech as a world, a sort of messy world where activism merges with advocacy, which merges with administrative work. This is maybe a problem if you're an academic, but it's actually a great space to be in if you're a young researcher. And I know it might sort of turn our stomachs to be like, oh, well, if you're an anthropologist, you can go, work for the man or whatever. That's actually a tremendous, from my perspective as like one of these alt academics who tried to do the tenure track thing for 5 years, got some interviews, nothing kind of hit, moved on, did my own practice. That's actually a space of opportunity, I think, for a lot of folks, to sort of, if you can keep your head above water, and it's doing the sort of work for you that you want it to, which, as I think Cyd and I have both sort of, hinted at and discussed, like that's actually not always true. It's always a space of sort of political contention. But I do think that's something that's an interesting space for particularly a lot of, grad folks on, graduate students probably on this call and early career folks to sort of see it as a space where they can have some influence, in the public sector and in sort of translating academic work, not just sort of translating academic work for the public, but doing, sort of this idea of public sociology and sort of that idea and doing work in the public and with the public.
Right. And I have little direct experience of the academic sphere, but my training is in sociolinguistics, and so it's a particularly fascinating space to be operating in and just seeing, looking at just valorization of different uses of terms and the ways that they're used in power dynamics. And when you get into a space like a courtroom, you suddenly have linguistic pragmatics operating at this whole level where a speech act can influence a whole society. So people who are inclined in that direction too, I think, I agree with you, David, that they have to be careful and keep that meta awareness going, but it seems like a really rich space of study, potentially.
Great, thank you. And I'm afraid I think we're almost out of time. We are basically out of time. So unless anybody else on the panel is burning with desire, I think we had better wrap things up. We have no open questions and I don't see the co-panelists jumping up and down. So I think it remains for me to thank Alex and all three of the panelists for a really interesting discussion, which has kind of more than sketched. It's shown ways in which technology and how ethnographic understanding has important insights of great political importance. So a really nice way of getting the terms seminar going. And thank you, all three of you. And we will reconvene in 2 weeks' time. I think, oh, I should have looked. I think it's something about music. So completely different, or maybe completely the same topic. Or the discussion will be the same. And Alex has got his guitar ready. Very good. Very good. So thank you all, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.